All right, 93, 93, 93. This is Aman Asha Renew from AshaRenew.com. Today I am live streaming from OBS. So let me know if this live stream is better than the last one, which was not utilizing OBS. So in the meantime, we will be speaking about current events. And of course, tying everything back to the spirituality and the occultism of it all. I also have on screen the iPad, so I will be drawing just to keep things a little bit more entertaining. 93 Josh, salute to you. So the first thing we're going to speak on is the US has officially banned Russian oil. So if you were listening to my previous video, I spoke on how the US is funding both sides of the current conflict, because we were still not only buying oil from Russia, but also still doing business in Russia. Several corporations were still doing business in Russia. So since then, we have banned the Russian oil. So what this means is we will continue to see higher gas prices. So if we think the gas prices are high now, and that was before the Russian ban, expect the prices to climb even higher, because now we have to find a different source of oil, which most likely will be more expensive. So essentially, this will affect all of us in one way or another. So as we see every day, there's always more pieces to add to the overall equation to give us a better perspective of the overall picture. I also want to speak on the Russian-Ukraine conflict in terms of the historical context, because I've been doing further research just to get a better understanding of how do we get here, the build-up. And according to my research, I realized that this has been going on since about 2008. Because 2008 was the year that Russia had invaded Georgia. Not the Georgia in the US, but the country over there in Europe. The reason this happened is because of the same reason Ukraine is going through what it's going through now. Because in 2008, Georgia wanted to join NATO. So NATO was a factor in 2008. So the same position Ukraine is playing, Georgia went down the same route. And eventually Georgia lost that war against Russia. So this was in 2008. Now, if we fast forward to 2014, what occurred in 2014 was the previous president of Ukraine did a deal with the EU. And because he did the deal, or was attempting to do a deal with the EU, it caused the people to protest, in which many people died in that protest, to the point where he had to flee the country. He fled to Russia, and I'm speaking about the previous president of Ukraine. It got so bad that he had to flee to Russia. Which then brings us to today's current events. Because the reason that occurred in the first place in 2014 is due to corruption. So Russia has been speaking on the corruption in Ukraine for a very long time now, as Russia sees NATO as a direct threat. So when NATO was speaking to Georgia about joining, Russia saw that as a threat, the same way Russia sees Ukraine being a part of NATO as a threat. However, according to current events, Zelensky, which is the president of Ukraine, said that he's not really trying to deal with NATO like that anymore. He doesn't really want to be seen as a president that's particularly begging to be a part of NATO. So we're not really going to hear too much of that talk, because he can clearly see that it's really not going to happen, or it would have happened by now. The reason it is not happening is because once a country becomes a part of NATO, if any type of invasion occurs, then the rest of the countries that are a part of NATO will back them up. So if anything kicked off, then it would be troops or forces, artillery coming from everywhere, because that would be a direct violation. So this is why it's such a problem for Putin or Russia, for Georgia or Ukraine to be a part of NATO, which is an enemy, because they don't have Russia's best interests. And this is why we are here now, because Ukraine essentially has been having conversations, of course, with NATO and the US and just the whole Western world about their independence. And they understood that in order for them to be independent, they had to rise up against Russia. But of course, they knew that they couldn't do it alone. So this is the entire point of them trying to become a part of NATO, to declare their independence. But as we are currently seeing, it comes at a great cost, because the independence of Ukraine becomes a threat to Russia, because becoming a part of NATO means that you can have nuclear weapons. So if Ukraine becomes nuclear, then of course Russia sees this as a direct threat, because Ukraine is literally on the borders of Russia. So we see this conflict has been going on for quite some time, even longer than I realized, and we're just seeing everything coming to a head. So things have been sizzling in the background for quite some time. So even though it seems like things are just kicking off very quickly and rapidly, we see that this has been building up for quite some time. Now the question, how does China factor into the conflict? It's not that China has anything necessarily to do with Russia and Ukraine, because we see that this is really an issue of Ukraine being nuclear, which China China is not a part of NATO, so China would not have a say so in Ukraine becoming nuclear whatsoever. So China doesn't necessarily play a direct role in this conflict, as China isn't necessarily pro-Ukraine, even though China has spoken out against the actions of Putin. But China isn't necessarily pro-Ukraine, as the US is pro-Ukraine, and China isn't necessarily on the same team as the US. So any country that is essentially on the same team of the US is potentially an enemy of China, either openly or secretly. The reason why China will become more important in the future is not just because of Taiwan, because Taiwan is essentially in a predicament, just like Ukraine declaring its independence, but China does not officially acknowledge the independence of Taiwan. Taiwan is, according to China, still a part of China. They are not separate. So the same thing we see happening in Ukraine in the Declaration of Freedom, we see happening in Taiwan. And that's why a lot of people have been speculating things are going to get pretty sticky in Taiwan due to this same reason. These foreign interests that we are not necessarily willing to die for. In other words, we see that we are not necessarily sending troops to die in Ukraine because Ukraine is not necessarily worth dying for according to American interests. We can do business all day, but in terms of sending people to die there, it's not that deep. Again, which is why Ukraine is not a part of NATO, meaning it's not that deep. We're not going to send people to die for that cause that we're not necessarily really invested in, even though we are funding both sides. Once again, we're not necessarily willing to die for it. And we're going to see what's going to happen with Taiwan. Will we be willing to die for them? That's yet to be told. But if we take what occurred in Afghanistan and also what is occurring in Ukraine, we still have Americans that were trapped over there who did not have a way home. So there's Americans that got left in Afghanistan, and there are Americans currently in Ukraine with no way to get back to the homeland. So we just look at the current situation and see, well, how does this play out for China or Taiwan? We see that Taiwan isn't necessarily looking at the U.S. with the brightest lens currently, even though we have sworn to protect them. So it's going to always be talk about China because there's always this looming threat that China may invade Taiwan the same way they invaded Hong Kong. You see, you don't hear anything about the protests in Hong Kong anymore. That has been completely shut down. But back around the time when George Floyd was the main topic, they were protesting all the way in Hong Kong, but again, that got shut down, as China does not want to look at Hong Kong as an independent entity. So there's a lot of factors on the board because it all comes down to what are you willing to die for. And if you are not willing to die for it, but you are willing to fund the war, you're willing to put money in the pockets of those who will fight, but you are not willing to pay the same sacrifice. So to us, it's business. And it will always be capitalism and business, even if people's lives are lost or allies or are gained in the process. Another thing that's been going on in the media, something a little bit more lighthearted, is about the Joro spiders. which are spreading in southeastern US. These spiders are giant and venomous. So now we have giant and venomous spiders. That's just going to be a part of civilization at this point. So time will tell whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Now, of course, it will be bad if people start getting bit, which we know is inevitable. But they also may add on to the environment in ways that we may not know. So that is yet to be told. But nonetheless, this was a topic, or is a topic, that is in the media. So I'm bringing it to you. Also, there is a new study on COVID that says COVID may cause brain shrinkage. So the newest updates about COVID is it may cause brain shrinkage. So basically, they're speaking about the long-term effects of COVID. So I'm seeing more and more symptoms about long-term COVID, and more it's beginning to seem like COVID will be a long-term thing. You may not necessarily die instantly or rapidly, but COVID is essentially here to stay. Even if it's not a pandemic, it will still be something that we will have to deal with internally for quite some time. This is what it's seeming like. And I'm not going to go too deep into that because obviously medical misinformation. So I'm just explaining what's going on in the news, and we will arrive at our own original conclusions. Finally, accepting being the spirit of this son, Jesus. Yes, as we pay attention to the planetary alignments, which I can pull up right now. The sun is either in Aquarius or Pisces, depending on Eastern alignments or Western alignments. So when it comes to Western alignments, the sun is in Pisces, which means the sun is in the asylum. The sun is in the 12th house. Not literally the 12th house, but the 12th house in terms of Pisces, which represents the unconscious mind. So we are pulling our personal power from our unconscious mind currently during this season of Pisces, which enhances your psychic abilities. Which is why Josh basically said, I've been doing spiritual work. I haven't really been into the conflict because we are in the time of Pisces. We are in the time of rest. We are in the time where spirituality is, you can say, a lot more powerful than what's going on in the media. So we're going to feel that for the remainder of this Pisces season. And as we knew, the new moon was also in Pisces, which we will be feeling the effect of till the new moon. So there's a lot of energy of Pisces, which represents the Christ consciousness. So I understand why you put Son Jesus, because the Sun in Pisces will represent the Sun and Christ consciousness, which represent your descent into the underworld. In order for you to embody Christ consciousness, you must descend into the underworld, because that's where you will find your ability to become reborn in a lighter form. So we're about 20 minutes in. Again, we're not going to be here too long, but let me at least put something on the screen so you're just not looking at a blank white image here. I also did not speak about the new moon crater, even though I put that in the title of my last live stream. I actually didn't speak about the new moon crater. I think I spoke about it briefly. That space junk hit the moon at about 5,800 miles per hour. But in terms of the effect it has had on us, I know personally two people that were initiated into the hospital briefly, not long term, but briefly, when that impact occurred. So we are yet to feel the fullness of that impact. Because we know the moon has a very strong influence over the planet Earth and all of the beings on the planet Earth, as the moon used to be a part of the planet Earth, according to legend. This is what gives the moon its magnetic abilities over the Earth. So when we have new craters being created unnaturally, as the moon is always creating its own craters, but when it happens with an impact or unnaturally, now it creates a shift of consciousness, as once again the sun is in Pisces, but also the new moon was in Pisces. So we have this heavy Pisces energy while the moon is getting impacted. So if we are speaking about Pisces energy, then we are speaking on the dark side of the moon. So if we are speaking about the dark side of the moon, the side of the moon that is never seen or observed by the human eye, this is where the magnetism of the moon is contained. And because the magnetism of the moon is contained on its dark side, that means that the moon actually influences not only the subconscious mind, but also the unconscious mind. The unconscious mind is where our true power is, but it is unfiltered. So your true power is in the unconscious, but the unconscious doesn't have a filter. So most of the time it becomes destructive. And at minimum, just disrupting. However, that same energy, if properly channeled, will open you up to new spiritual planes. And this is the positive attributes of Pisces. It can initiate you into the asylum or hospital, and it can also open up new spiritual worlds for you. So once again, we're not going to be here too long. Just doing some little art as we go through these current events. Also, tech stocks are down about 75% from their high last year. So tech stocks are taking a major blow, especially Facebook. Facebook has lost about 30% of its value, I believe, in 2022. Also, what's been in the news, rather, is rock art, which depicts giants that they say were extinct in the Ice Age, which are like petroglyphs. And I've seen petroglyphs with my own eyes, as there are many of them in Nevada. So I've seen these petroglyphs and I've seen the giants in which they depict. In the case of the Southwest, the giants that they depict are called the ant people, which are said to have come from out of the earth and have taught them, or who taught them, how to grow food within caves. So they were able to grow beans without sunlight. So there's a lot of controversy going on as to were there actual giants, just like were there actual dinosaurs? Were there actual people that were 8 feet tall, 9 feet, whatever we determine is giant status? Some people even take it all the way to the Anunnaki, if we want to take it there. And some are of the opinion these are simply spirits. These were never speaking about physical beings. And I'm not here to say who's right or who's wrong, because it is all interesting. In your opinion, do the changes in nature have to do with changes happening at a spiritual level, or is it just mathematics based on the cycle? It is both, as science and mathematics go very well together. So yes, part of it is scientific and part of it is mathematical. The mathematical part is, yes, we are always going through cycles, beginning new cycles, ending old cycles. That's a constant in the universe. So in terms of what's going on spiritually, or what's going on in the celestial plane, or the star intelligence, we will find that these cycles are not necessarily unique. As if we look back in history at these same planetary alignments, we will see similar cycles. Even though every moment is unique, nonetheless, we see patterns because everything is mathematical. So it is because of the mathematics that we can detect patterns in the past, present, or future. So our ability to detect the patterns and to see these cycles at all is due to mathematics. The science comes in when we are decoding or interpreting the mathematics. And that's where we get the science from. It's the interpretation of the symbols or the mathematics. As mathematics is symbols or symbolic, it is symbolic code, just like the occult is all mathematics. Now, what you do with those symbols are based upon your science. How scientific are you? So based upon how mathematical you are and how scientific you are, that will determine how nature affects you directly, because consciousness matters. We already know whether you are consciously observing something or not influences the results. As we study the double slit theory, if we are paying attention, it alters the results. So meaning whether your consciousness is aware of the current events will determine how it affects you, because your consciousness is a part of it. So whatever your consciousness is a part of, that will determine how that particular event or situation, whatever we want to call it, affects you. So if we want to call it cycles, mathematical cycles, well, how do mathematical cycles affect you? Well, that's based on how you interpret these mathematical cycles and symbols. Because based on your interpretation, and let me give you a perfect example. Let's just take the symbol, the cross. The cross is a universal symbol. However, the cross alters depending on where you are in the world. So you can say the whole world worships Christ. There's people all over the world that worship Christ, but they don't worship the same cross. The cross alters. The same cross we look at is not the same cross that they look at in Africa, which is not the same cross they look at in Asia, even though you can say it's all Christianity, just as an example. But their symbols are not the same. Their stories have slight alterations and sometimes major alterations, which would, of course, help you to arrive at different conclusions. So depending on whether you're in the East or the West, you have a unique perspective of the Christ consciousness, just as an example, because you are interpreting and being influenced by a different set of symbolisms. So as we see here, of course, I'm just doing some freestyles. We're going to see what it ends up being. Also, yesterday I spoke about there are still American companies supporting Russia, such as Starbucks and McDonald's and Coca-Cola. And since the last video, they have also pulled out of Russia. And I'm sure it was because of the immense amount of pressure. So that's another thing I wanted to mention as well. And I'll probably wrap this up around an hour. So we got about 19 more minutes here. Again, we're going to see how the art comes out. But we also going to continue to speak about things. Yeah, so I'm probably going to add one more thing here. And we'll see how it all comes together stacked up. All right, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Let me show you the final result. Again, I'm just playing around with the colors and such, see what we come up with. We put the final touches. Again, just a quick little freestyle here, something more artistic. So now it looks like this. Now, this becomes a background for the next piece. So let me show you that. We'll go ahead and wrap it up. So give me a second. Let me just take this off. Let me go ahead and save it. And I'm going to open up a new file as that as the background image. So let me do that right now. So go ahead and make this easy. So I want to save that. All right. Back, import, add, insert photo. Let's see. All right. Now, as you see, we can take it as deep as we want, but of course, we're going to wrap this up in about 5 minutes. So again, I just want to make this a little bit more artistic, even though, we speak about serious topics and all that. Just wanted to show y'all my creative process. To see where all this art comes from, just doing things to see what happens. All right, so I'm gonna add one final touch because we see it looks a little dark, so I'm gonna add a final touch to lighten it up, and we'll check up out of here. So let's see. I'm gonna add in a photo from a previous session. So this is a piece from a previous session. So I'm gonna put that on top, see what happens. All right, there we go. Again, just whipped up something real quick, just to show something a little more unique. Zooming in a little bit. So I appreciate everybody for tuning in while I cook up the piece. Hopefully the result looks a little nice, looks a little psychedelic. You know, something a little more mysterious than we usually see. So I will be back at y'all with more current events, planetary, astrology, numerology, and all these things. So just mainly want to make sure that the audio as well as the visuals were good. So I'm going to rewatch this playback, make sure everything was good. Hopefully everybody enjoy. Again, we're not going to take up too much time. So salute to everyone. 93, 93, 93.